idea of knowing they are busy with Kia. The system notifies Jared of several complaints as many problems were spreading throughout the territory because of Corvos. Suddenly Lakaz arrives like a savior and calls for his lord. Jared asks what happened and his guard explains that there is a problem in the village of Dean. Lax explains that a leader was assigned not long ago to take care of the village, but the soldiers receive reports that this leader hasn't been doing his job. The guard also states that the villagers came to him crying, asking for help to restore the village to normal, and not only that, everyone had heard that this leader has been drinking every day and occupying himself by drawing the scene pictures. Jared comments that it seems this person hasn't learned anything despite the state the territory is in, then activating his recklessness ability, which he stole from PRA. Young man declares he will have to go there and discipline him personally. After a while the Lord finally arrives at the humble village of Dean. They head to the place where Dean's leader was, and a furious Jared kicks the door open. The gum man bursts in with his subordinates and Lakis calls for the village chief Julian, ordering him to come out of hiding immediately. Lays continues calling for Julian, and one of Kia's soldiers notices something on the wall and becomes embarrassed. The gunman sees several Obese drawings and all the soldiers are astonished, while the chief of the guard becomes angry with them. Amidst all those drawings and bottles of alcohol, a young man dressed in white questions who is there. Lacey's asks this person if he is Julian. Jared uses his mind's eye to analyze this person, thinking that he's seen many talents before, all of them with their unique gifts, and he ensured that all those talents were developed as quickly as possible, even if just a little. However, the young man is impressed as this guy is nothing like that of all the people he has seen so far. He is the closest to perfection. Julian's appearance is revealed a simple man with long white hair. Julian introduces himself, stating that he is the leader of the village and asks if there is something wrong. The chief of the guard becomes irritated, but Jared asks his soldier to wait and says he will speak before saying anything. Jared thinks to himself that Julian, even being so skilled, was hiding it for some reason, so the Lord asks why the young man has never done anything for that village, as he wasn't being paid to slack off. Boldly the young man explains that it's because everything there is normal. He comments that he doesn't think there is anything that needs taken care of and that shouldn't be in such an insignificant village. Lacey sees that as an insult and immediately draws his sword, angered by such blasphemy. However, Jared asks the young man to stop and then sits on the floor calling Julian's name. The Lord asks if Julian doesn't think that job is suitable for him, and the young man fully agrees with a plan in mind. The blonde asks the village leader to tell the truth and accuses Julian of not doing it because he didn't want to, but rather because he didn't have the skill for it. Feeling insulted, the white-haired young man responds that he simply didn't want to, and if he wanted he could easily do it. Jared then asks if he could prove it, and Julian says that if the Lord wanted he could supervise him. Seeing this heated exchange between the two, Lax becomes extremely confused. Julian then starts his work, calling for his assistant right after the young man asks his servant to retrieve all the past documents as he would assess all the village's cases and problems. While waiting for the paperwork, Julian asks Jared and his soldiers to help remove the obscene drawings from the wall. Jared agrees, and then he and his subordinates begin cleaning up the place. Julian starts solving the village's problems, even the small ones like a woman who was having trouble with her calf or some disputes that were occurring between merchants. Even the people producing honey asked Julian for help, and the young man promptly assisted them. The young man, after analyzing some papers, goes to Lacey's and says that it seems someone was suffering money from the harvest profits. Observing all of this, Jared is impressed as the village leader did a month's worth of work in just half a day. After finishing everything, Julian states that everyone with resolved problems and the citizens can leave the room. With that, the Lord also asks his soldiers to leave as he want to have a private conversation with Julian. He sits in front of the village chief and says that he now understands why Julian was so confident, because the young man truly has talent. The young white-haired man apologizes for his lack of effort in managing the village up until that day, explaining that since he knew he could do the job with ease, he ended up procrastinating. Jared says it's fine and states that he understood the young man's plan to get the Lord's attention. Julian, realizing he had been found out, is surprised. The village leader then says he has only one question for the Lord. and asks what the boy's dream is in some flashbacks of Julian. We see his father mistreating him, telling him not to think about foolish things like dreams. The boy was always mistreated, and even though he was recognized for his ability, his dreams were crushed because he was a commoner. Even Horo said he brought the boy there because he aced the command test of his empire and the bald man to destroy Julian's dreams. In Julian's opinion, a leader's ambitions must be greater than the combined ambitions of all his people. And even the boy is extremely happy. He tells Jared that for a long time he had been searching for someone he could admire. The man also comments that heir is a lord who underestimates his vassal. Then the fault lies not with a vassal but with the lord. Then, while serving a drink, Julian requests that by the end of that year Jared either become a count or lead a group of territories to prove his dream. The blonde responds that he will show the young man who he truly is. Jared, with a gle smile, then asks if Julian would like to rule by his side, laughing. The young man replies that there is no way he could oppose a lord who has completely earned his respect. However, he will leave without hesitation if Jared fails. While toasting, the Lord of Kriba declares that they will be together for eternity and that he will make Julian the chief executive to manage all the internal affairs of Mura in Kia. While cleaning the mansion, Hayes wonders when the Lord will return home. The young woman notices Ayla and the war veteran Oris talking. The two are discussing the new vassal who will take on the role of chief executive over the entire territory. Orin is also present and notices Hayes' expression. The elder then asks if the young woman will also greet the lord upon his arrival. Realizing that Jared was finally returning home, the young woman becomes extremely happy and answers affirmatively. In Mura, after Julian was appointed as chief executive, the territory quickly stabilized. Jared work even harder, seeing his subordinates' dedication, and in the last week he practically live in the office. Hayes knocks on the door where our protagonist was, and upon entering she offers the young man some tea made from the carcass flower. She mentions that she heard it's good for weight loss, so she bought a little, but Jared thinks that his diet had already ended. Nevertheless, he accepts. The woman continues to pamper the boy while Julian simply observes. The white-haired young man asks his lord to take a rest, but the boy responds that he's fine. Julian insists once again for his lord to rest, and reluctantly Jerry considers it. The white-haired man then states that he's going to meet with the other vassals and will return shortly, and Jared simply acknowledges this in his mind. Jared reflects that his Kia vassals, upon hearing the rumors, came to see with their own eyes if Julian was truly up to the task. However, they recognized the young man's skills and began praising him. Immensely impressed by his dedication, our protagonist, accepting the offer of tea, asks that since there's an extra cup, Haiti should drink it with him. However, still think of herself as a simple maid, she becomes embarrassed, saying she couldn't do that in front of her lord. The lord mentions that he has said this many times before and repeats once again that when they are alone she doesn't need to worry about such formalities. Hayes accepts, saying she will do so with all due respect. They soon serve themselves the tea and begin drinking, while the maid just watches her lord. The blonde suddenly asks if the girl is going to quit being a maid, and at that moment she spits out all the tea in her mouth. Trembling, the young woman asks what he meant by that, almost crying. Hayes asks if she wasn't doing a good job as a maid, so the lord tries to explain that wasn't what he meant. The maid comments that when she arrived at the office everything was clean and wonders if it was because of her lack of skill. The young man tries to reassure her, saying he only did that to learn cleaning magic, as there would be a time when he would need to use it. Then gently Jerry uses magic to clean the woman's clothes that were stained with tea. The young man says that since Hayes is now a healer she could be promoted to a higher position, so she would sto being a maid. Still with tears, the girl says she didn't want another maid taking care of Jared, and irritated, he lightly taps her on the head, asking her to obey him at least once in her life. Hayes then states that if she had to stop being a maid she would stop being a healer. At that moment a necklace begins to glow behind Jared. A strong light spreads throughout the room, and a voice speaking about death and despair starts coming from that mysterious amulet. Looking at it, Hayes and Jared are confused, just listening to the words from that strange object that starts to float. After that, suddenly the pendant's glow fades and the accessory falls onto the table where it was. Hayes asks what that was, and Jared explains that it was an artifact that criminal possessed. Looking at that object, the boy thinks that it is the tears of Mahart, and normally it's just an artifact that increases your base stats by 25 points, but the true purpose of that object is to be a key to an ancient cacum that lies beneath Mura. Jared then asks if Hayes wanted to go outside for a bit since there was a place he always wanted to go to since he arrived in Murga. Even confused by that attitude, the young woman agrees. In another place in a small town called Moray in the kingdom of Lenta, someone named Belen is being called a mailman was KN knocking on the young man's door stating that he had a letter for him. Belton answers the door and receives the letter, and the mailman also mentions that there were some pretty big boxes arriving there. Right after he bids farewell to the civilian, and the young man thanks him for delivering the letters, reading that paper and with a bag of money beside him. The man thinks that person was quite impressive in the letter. Jared introduces himself and offers greetings to the man, stating that he wanted some tips since the young man was a veteran. The civilian supposes that that's why Jared gave him so many gold coins, as he wants him to accept that as payment and go meet him. While thinking that it was strange, what previously looked like a young man begins to change shape. Then the youth takes on a different appearance, transforming into a man named Ballard, a great elderly tier N mage. After his transformation, he states that even Jared's words were strange, as he mentioned that he found a clue to evolve to tier 5. The mage thinks that even geniuses have no idea what to do to advance in tier, and that was really odd. With that name in mind, he begins to question who that person was to speak with such confidence, and after a while a realization dawns on him. Barter remembers that Jared is the useless son of Barry, but he doesn't know how a chubby boy like that could be acting that way. Burning the letter with his magic, Ballard states that he will have to go there to confirm. After all, a great mage also needs to have the necessary talent to evolve back in Mura. At this moment, Jared was walking with his companion Hayes. Our protagonist was standing right where the catacombs were possibly discovered. He asks Hayes what she thought of the place, and the young woman comments that aside from the tree being green, it looked pretty normal. Suddenly the sand in the forest begins to take a strange form and something appears before them. Jared, realizing what it was, asked the maid to take 5 steps. Behind him a strange figure formed from the grains of sand imposingly asks who dares to enter its catacomb. Jared recognizes the being as Mahark, and somehow the divinity also seems to recognize the blonde. The unknown entity identifies the young man as a cursed one who does not belong to this world, and is surprised that he appeared right in front of it. Hearing this, our protagonist becomes extremely nervous, thinking he has been discovered. Mahar then asks the boy to leave immediately, because when his curses resonate, the world will witness its end. Jared is deeply confused, wondering if Mahar truly knows who he is. The young man supposes that Mahart might be talking to Shin Pong, who exists within Jared's body. After calming down, the young man remembers that the dialogue was similar to what was in the game, so Mahart might just be mistaken. The Lord asks why Mahart is saying that, but the figure replies that they should no longer speak and that Jared should not disturb his rest as he creates some magic missiles. Jared thinks that the way Mahart talks about himself is no different from the game, and feels relieved he wasn't discovered. He then tells the figure that they won't achieve anything by talking at that moment, and suggests they meet again in the future. Seeing this attitude, the entity declares that Jared has chosen death. With such behavior, the young man launches his magic at Mahart, and as it strikes, a figure begins to disintegrate as the creature disappears. An opening emerges behind it. Hayes is delighted that they found the entrance, so Jared and she enter the place. After the exploration back at the Lord's mansion in Mura, in his office, the maid and her lord are analyzing some maps. The young woman asks if she missed anything, and before the answers, Carrard thinks that they have finally drawn all the places they had seen. He then replies to the girl that she undoubtedly drew everything perfectly. The young man also comments that he didn't know the girl had a talent for drawing maps, and she explains that when she was younger she followed her father everywhere and learned from him. Finally, the Lord remarks that this skill is extremely useful in his eyes, and the girl smiles, excited by the compliment. He also asks her when Mary said she would arrive in MCA, and Hayes explains that Mary mentioned she had some work to finish, so she would arrive in about 2 days. With that, Jared asks if Hayes could cook for him that day, and the young woman eagerly agrees. Excited, she runs to the kitchen and asks the young man to wait a moment. A bit shy, the boy thinks that her exaggerated excitement sometimes worried him. He turns his attention back to the catacomb, and our protagonist mentions that he explored about half of the place with haze, going through safe areas without enemies to map the dungeon. Shin recalls that Mahar's ancient tomb was known in Paradiso as the Mirror Dungeon. In the gang of anyone who wanted to defeat the Demon King's advisor needed to gain access to the Mirror Dungeon quest. A mirror drug dealer in the future, would become an extremely powerful magnet, all thanks to the artifacts he stole from the Mirror Dungeon in the game. The large-scale dungeon was barely found, and was finally discovered due to a mistake made by one of the developers as a result of the tomb's notoriety for being impossible to locate. Many guilds gathered to complete the dungeon quest. Thanks to everyone helping each other during the raid, the dungeon would be cleared easily. However, that was what everyone expected until they faced true despair. In fact, without even getting close to the boss Mahar, they were completely annihilated, and after such a shocking defeat, many people banded together and form a union of guilds to attempt the dungeon once again. This was only to fail once more, realizing how insignificant they were compared to that. Being the young man also reflects that the fact a small guild managed to clear the dungeon was extremely surprising at the time. He states that everything he had done up until that day is insignificant compared to Mahar's strength. In other words, one mistake could lead to his death. So he had to prepare with that in mind. A few days later, still in that mansion, we see a silence settling in. Haze was leaning against the door, spying on her lord, while in her head she comments that her master has been acting suspiciously recently. The one mentions that Jared has been cleaning the entire mansion with his cleaning magic, calling a training. He has also been storing artifacts he normally wouldn't use for some unknown reason, and finally he has been drawing, claiming it was part of his studies. The young woman racks her brain trying to understand why, and realizing she couldn't figure it out, assumes there must be some special reason. Aki appears behind Jared and asks if the young man has recently been learning how to draw. Jared replies affirmatively and asks if he could request the young man to sell a few things. He hands over a stack of obscene drawings and explains that Julian had drawn them, and since the papers were just taking up space, he could get rid of them. Embarrassed, Aki agrees to find a buyer and exits the room. Finally, the blonde asks why Julia had been drawing those, and the young man responds that he simply had some free time during the nights. In his head, our protagonist couldn't believe that the young man had already found free time in his schedule and was surprised by how much energy he had. Lacus informs Jared that a carriage from Kbaya has arrived at the mansion, and our protagonist says he will be there shortly. He then calls for Hayes to help him, and a young woman quickly responds. She helps Jared put on his arm, and while doing so she asks if the place he's going to is the ruins they visited earlier. The young man confirms, and she asks if she would be a burden if she went to, which the Lord replies that the place he's going this time would be better explored with fewer people. Resigned, Hayes replies that she would prefer if he didn't go, as it's a dangerous place, and she would rather accompany him. In his head, the young man agrees, thinking that he too wanted her company since this world is real and he couldn't revive like in the game, but that sorceress and Mistress Ella is a skilled swordswoman, so it made sense for the two of them to be there. However, she doesn't understand why she is also there if she doesn't see herself as useful for anything. The boy retorts that the girl is of extreme importance to the catacomb and would be very useful. Kay remains silent for a moment, not understanding what he meant, but she lets it go. After some time walking through the dungeon, Ella expresses her disdain for the Demon Kingdom and the blood of the Dark Church. And even though she didn't think it was the case, Ella asks if Jared was there to gain power through darkness. The young man responds that he wasn't, and his only goal in that place was to acquire an artifact. The redhead is relieved, saying that if that wasn't the case, they might have ended up fighting. Nervous, the young man lets out a small laugh, saying that it's a relief that won't happen. Looking at her, the boy realizes that the woman is quite devoted to light and tends to exaggerate a lot. Suddenly, Isabel points out that the path is becoming clearer, and Jared responds that it means they are almost at the end of the labyrinth. He explains that after the labyrinth there's only one path left, and they will have to pass through a few chambers until they reach the end of the dungeon. Finally, the raid begins, and the three adventurers arrive in front of a large gate guarded by soldiers. The clay soldiers stand in position, holding their spears ready to defend whatever lies behind the door. Jared then tells Isabella that they will use the strategy they discussed earlier, and the young woman agrees. The girl kneels, and from her hand a dark shadow begins to spread across the ground. The darkness reaches two of the clay soldiers, agitating them. For some reason they completely ignore Jared and charge straight toward Isabella. Quick White, the Lord takes advantage of the opportunity and strikes all those creatures from behind. As a result, the soldiers, unable to react, start to crumble and close step in finishing off the remaining ones from two of those creatures. Two purple crystals fall to the ground. Isabella is impressed that the clay soldiers only went after her and wonders why they ignore Jared. While picking up one of the dark stones, the young man admits he isn't entirely sure, but he knows those creatures always go after dark mages first. With the stones in hand, the boy states that since they defeated the guardians, they should disguise themselves, and then he hands the two magical stones to the girls. They then approach the gigantic gate with an engraved symbol and proceed to open it to disguise themselves. All four warriors in the group on the heads of the clay soldiers. Once inside, Isabella is startled to see an army of those warriors in the room. Ella is equally astonished, commenting that it's incredible in estimating there are at least 2,000 soldiers present at that moment. The former demon questions her lord if their disguise will work, and the young man explains that as long as their faces match those of the soldiers, they should be fine. The four begin to walk toward the end of the room, and Isabella remains nervous about the situation. The only one who stays calm is Jared, who silently notes that there are at least 2,500 clay soldiers there. Jared recalls that when the raid of 500 people in Paradiso reached this place, there were 3,000 clay soldiers, resulting in a difficult and protracted battle. The young man believes that since the number of people in his group is small, they don't look suspicious. And there is something even more important thanks to the disguise of effect CLO place on their masks. They could easily pass without fighting. Finally, as they reach their destination, the young man turns to Isabella and states that nothing happened, just as he said. CL mentions that it's good to know her masks were useful and that the skill was of great importance. Jared comments that even though the clay monsters had poor vision, if they hadn't camouflaged themselves it would have been spotted immediately behind her mask. Kay feels extremely excited and happy to have been useful, exclaiming that raids are a lot of fun. However, Isabella isn't as pleased. Silly, watching as her lord praises another girl. She approaches Jared, touches his shoulder, and declares that she helped to sighing. The young man admits he can avoid it and begins clapping his hands, congratulating her. CL and her mistress watched the scene, somewhat confused by the exchange. After some time they reach another chamber, and the group approaches a giant gorilla-like beast, all of them impressed by the creature's size. Isabella remarks that these monsters look somewhat like undead, yet they are different. Jared explains that it's because they were born from curses which are not the same as dark magic. Before entering his slumber, the monarch Mahar cursed his subordinates, transforming them into beings that would not age, as it was difficult for everyone to maintain their original appearances, must lost their bodies and became clay figures. Ella, hearing this, deduces that all those soldiers are Mahart's subordinates, and remarks that Mahart must have been greatly despised. The young Elle comments that some of the clay soldiers managed to retain parts of their original bodies, so they should be cautious. Suddenly the giant clay gorilla, which had been motionless, turns and seems to notice something from behind its mask. The beast's eye appears human, and it senses what's happening. Immediately it charges toward the group, catching them off guard. With a sudden battle, the creature slams the ground, creating a gust of wind and sending debris flying in all directions. After the loud crash, it's clear that Jared managed to escape, holding Isabella in his arms as he leaps into the air. CLO and her mistress also avoid being hit by the gorilla's attack and remain unharmed. Isabella doesn't understand why the monster attacked them, and Jared remarks that it shouldn't have happened. He thinks to himself that the dungeon has changed, likely due to his being transported to this world. The clay monster doesn't relent and quickly charges again, this time aiming to grab both Jared and Isabella. However, our protagonist manages to escape and returns to the ground safely once again. Taking advantage of the gorilla being in the air, Ella urges everyone to move away from the soldier. Right after saying this, the young woman begins to prepare a wind spell around her sword. The redhead quickly launches her attack at the opponent, which is hit squarely by the magic. The monster is thrown back and a massive dust cloud fills the area. However, the soldier beast emerges, revealing that it had taken no damage from the blow. Jared and Ella are shocked by the sight. Once again, Ella asks what kind of magic that was, since the clay soldier backed off with just a phrase. Still nervous, Jared explains that the monster had a password to control it and wasn't an ordinary soldier. He asserts that with the magic the monster possessed, there was a small chance for the soldier to become invincible. The young man also comments that the chance was only 1% per person, making it a 4% chance against the group. CLO couldn't believe that something could make a creature invincible, but Jared explains that those monsters were created with curses, making their effects terrifying. These curses always generate some effect, like not allowing the soldier to leave a certain area, or even reducing his rationality. In some cases, monsters may not be able to distinguish between enemies and allies, attacking anything they see. Finally, Jared concludes that in such cases the creator establishes a password, and the password here was a Mahart. At that moment, everyone began to remove their masks. The girl was about to question the young man on how he knew that, but she remembers it was a secret and Jared wasn't going to tell. After a walk through the chambers, they arrive in one filled with numerous white pillars. There, a being with two voices greets them and calls the group intruders. This being is sustained by several grotesque bodies and introduces the place as the sanctuary of Lord Mahart. The creature reveals itself, showing that it had two heads, one represented by the sun and the other by the moon. Upon seeing the creature, Jared asks Ella and CLO to proceed as planned and draw the priest's attention. The sun side of the monster empowers some of its servants and orders them to hold off the intruders. Meanwhile, the moon side also strengthens its slaves but commands its soldiers to finish off the enemies. For some reason, the monsters seem to ignore Ella and charge for Isabella. The young woman panics, not understanding why those creatures are after her again, and Jared rushes to attack them. CL ignores the situation and charges at the priests, who summons grotesque magic in the form of several bodies united into a raven. The deformed raven tries to attack the elf, but she immediately dodges and counterattacks, wounding the priest. After cutting the monster's body, a hand made of creatures forms and goes after the elf. The priest manages to strike her, and the two heads continue to act in different ways. The moon side starts to berate its own slaves, claiming that they never learned. Seeing this, Ella thinks those who wield the power of darkness are truly unpleasant and grotesque. The red head tells the priest that the ones it is hitting are its own subordinates, but the creature disagrees. The second side of the monster says that the slaves will never reach the status of subordinates, as they are merely tools to be used by Mahar. Ella agrees while defending herself from some of those creatures, and then states that she believes Mahar sees the priest as a tool as well. The creature remains silent for a moment, and then the moon side responds that they are the most loyal servants of Mahar. The warrior retorts that even if they say that they don't know the truth, as they have become puppets and neither alive or dead. The sun begins to believe Ella's words, but the moon urges the other head not to trust her. The moon then extends part of his body to charge at the red head, declaring that it will not forgive her for her blasphemy. CLO, who was behind them, flies in to separate the two heads. The elf manages to slice through and cut the moon side, causing the priest to split in two. Ella seizes the opportunity and stabs the monster's back, mocking the moon for letting its guard down. Without hesitation, the woman